Good morning, everybody. I think we're just waiting for two more people, but we'll get going anyway. It's nice to see some of you. If you want to turn your camera on, that's absolutely fine. It'd be nice to see your faces. If you'd rather not, you can keep your camera off. And if you can keep yourself muted, unless you're talking, just to make things easier. Just to say that there are live captions available for this session. So on the control panel on the bottom, there should be a closed caption symbol. And if you can click on that, you can then view the subtitles and they should appear on the recording afterwards as well. So welcome to the first of two sessions of Planning to Reopen, hosted by Museum Development Northwest and led by Ben Melham from Mortice Consulting, who's waving at everybody. The session is being live captioned, as I said, and so we're joined by Joanne from Stage Text, who's working away in the background. I'm Kay Hardiman from Museum Development Northwest, and we're also joined on the call by my colleague Lindsay Jones, who's furiously sorting out all the technical stuff in the background. We'll also be joined later on by Rob Sanderson from Norton Priory Museum, who will be giving us a case study after they reopened the museum on the 4th of July. It's one of the first museums in the Northwest that opened up right at the start. Like I said, your cameras are turned on or off, that's up to you. You'll all be muted until you're speaking. The session will be recorded, so if you don't want to appear in the recording, keep your camera switched off. It will be edited and it will be shared by a private link with other museums in the Northwest. Throughout the session, do make use of the chat function. So again, on the control panel on the bottom, there's a little bubble and underneath it says chat. So if you can click on that and you can all introduce yourselves through the chat function, that would be lovely. Say who you are and which museum you represent. If your name doesn't show up properly under your video, you can rename yourself. If you go to participants and find yourself, there should be like a little dots and you can rename yourself that way. And yeah, that's it really. So they're welcome. And I'm going to hand over to Ben now, Ben Melham from Mortice Consulting, who's running these sessions for us, and he will introduce himself more thoroughly. Thanks very much, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Give me a little nod. As you can see, that's fantastic. You can hear me, brilliant. So before I disappear into PowerPoint, I thought I'd just say hello so you can see my face. And say, well, thank you for making the time to attend this session. It's obviously a really important subject at the moment and one that you're not embarking on in isolation. So what we're really targeting to do from the session today is to look at what the guidance is, much of which you would have seen already, but really try to flavour that with real life examples, with case studies, and also for the session today and the one further on this week, for you to ask questions, to collaborate, to share ideas. As Kay said already, please do use the chat function. You can use it to talk to me, to the rest of the co-hosts on the session, but equally happy if you want to use it to talk to each other. So please feel free to post questions. If you have observations as you go through, anything that you think you're not going to quite cover off, then do that. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat function, as will the other co-hosts. So if you've got a question that's not coming up or something you want to kind of really go into in detail, we'll try and cover that through. Yeah, but please do interact. It's lovely to meet you, and I'm going to try and put the slides up now and start the session. So, can everyone see that slide? Give me a thumbs up if you can see the slide. Technology is working, brilliant. So we've got the agenda you've all seen for today. A little bit of housekeeping has already been mentioned. The session's been recorded in order that this conversation can be shared more broadly. Feel free to share your participation and takeaways from the session, social media, or anything else, if the items you find useful. What everybody in the sector is trying to do at the moment, I think one of the most fulfilling things for me and for many people involved, is how the sector has come together at a time of crisis, and I think we should use that word, but we're responding and making sure that we're sharing best practice, and today's session is part of that conversation, but I really would encourage you to build it further, engage with your peers who aren't here on the call today, and really make sure we build forward and interact. So I'm going to go through a reasonable amount of content, so I will be talking, but please do make sure that you share those questions as you go through. So here's the timetable from today. Hopefully you've seen it already. We're split into 4 sessions. So session 1 and 2 are what we're covering off within the next 2 hours. The first section is broadly around just setting the context, setting some of the guidance framework that's out there, including some of the recent guidance from the National Museum Directors Council and others, and a bit of interactive activity to get you guys thinking and making sure that you're engaged in the session as well. And then the session 2, so we have a very short break before going into the second hour. As already been mentioned, we've got Rob from Norton Priory doing a case study. So you get to hear from one of your peers about their experiences, and there'll be an opportunity there within a limited time to ask some questions. So that'd be really useful. And then I'll go into more detail around some case studies from UK and some international case studies that I think are quite relevant. And we'll sum that up. You see at the end it says summary and homework setting. Don't worry, it's quite a light touch activity that we've amended for this session, so we'll go through that. And then in the next session, we're going to start to go down to some real focus areas. So you'll hopefully see from this that we're really focusing on operations. And what I really hope that you take away from this is some real kind of practical advice, some reassurance, and some ideas around how you can potentially implement these at your own institutions. So this is our timetable for today. I shall do my best to watch the clock as we go through, and I'm sure I'll be prompted if we vary from that at all. Very briefly, just so you know who I am, so I'm Ben Melham. I founded Mortice Consulting. We specialise exclusively in the cultural sector in operations. We're working with a large number of organisations, a large number of the nationals, but also smaller institutions. Above and beyond that, though, I'm really passionate about building the conversation. Most of us who choose to work in this sector do so because we're really passionate about it and we think it's doing a really, giving a really valuable service. So with that in mind, I founded the Cultural Sector FM Hub, which is a free membership networking group of those who are running buildings in the cultural sector, who have networking events. There's a very active WhatsApp group actually, and we've been running a whole series of webinars through lockdown. I'm also chair of the International Museum Construction Congress, looking at museum development across the world. We have a large conference that brings together specialists from around the world annually, although this year it's going to be a virtual event, unsurprisingly. And probably one of my proudest achievements, and some of you may be aware of this, I am the curator of museum toilets on Twitter. So I spend a lot of time talking about toilets. So we will cover that off during the sessions today. But if any of you that are interested, there is actually a free 90-minute webinar that we recorded and is available. So I can probably put the link for that up as well, and be more than happy that if you want to spend 90 minutes thinking about toilets, we can do that too. But we'll definitely will cover that off today. So that's a bit about me. And just back in the past, I used to run the national estate for the Science Museum Group, so looking after their estate nationally. And now we work with British Library, Imperial War Museum Group, Royal Museums Greenwich, Museum of London, and a whole host of other organisations as well. So that's enough about me. Icebreaker, and a little chance to get you guys started. So as we've already mentioned, we're very keen for you to use the chat function. So just to kind of warm you guys up, in the chat function, I just want you to put in there a statement, whatever words you want to put in, to say, what are you most concerned about when planning for the reopening of your site? And so just really just give a flavour. It may be one item, it may be a couple of things, but just to give a sense of what we're thinking about. So already one through already from Esther, volunteers, massively. I think volunteers, and we're definitely going to be covering that off at a few points over the coming days, particularly as volunteers, about how we engage with those. It's always we always have to think very carefully around that, and also volunteers who are potentially in vulnerable categories themselves. How do you engage with them? How do you make your volunteers feel comfortable about coming back onto site? Safety and infection control. Obviously, we're talking about responses to COVID here, so absolutely, we'll be talking about cleaning regimes and what needs to be put in place. Long-term availability of volunteers. Yeah, I think that the volunteers category is one that's going to come through. As a sector, we're heavily reliant on volunteers, and we've got to make sure that they're comfortable and happy to come back into the workplace along with any of our paid employees as well. Whether visitor numbers will come up. This is the million-dollar question that we're all looking at the moment, and it seems to be very context specific. We're going to look at some of the data that's come from Alva and others, and that's going to be informing in terms of the subject areas we're looking at. But there is some concern in the wider public whether people want to come back. Early signs from institutions that have opened already appear to be good. There seems to be quite a demand, but we need to look at the sustainability of that. Bringing furloughed staff back into work, another really important topic, that there's going to be a challenge at the point when the furlough scheme ends for a number of institutions where that furlough has been a real lifeline, and what changes for all of those. Safety of all visitors to the library, yeah, and I think one thing we're really going to try and cover off as well over the sessions is you will have a variety of visitors with a variety of needs and requirements and different ways of using the sites. So we really need to think about how we're accommodating all of those. Queue management, staff safety and well-being. I think the staff safety and well-being is something that's going to come through hopefully quite strongly, that ultimately our number one responsibility before we open the doors is making sure our staff and our volunteers are safe and comfortable, and we're going to be covering that off as well. Safety of staff and visitors, cleaning procedures, so we're going to touch on cleaning as well. These are a wide-ranging areas, and hopefully for all the areas that we will be covering off, we'll have to go through some of them fairly quickly. We will provide guidance and additional information where required as well. Managing the expectations of the visitors. Now, this is a really interesting one because we are going to be looking to implement solutions that will have an impact on the visitor experience. And I think what's evolved particularly over the last few weeks and months is organisations looking at the possibilities for creating positive experiences and looking where the opportunities can be to, if you are having to change how the site operates, how can that potentially be done in a positive way and that engages the visitors. And also we will talk about engaging with visitors before they even turn up at site. And this is going to be a significant part of getting your visitors to engage with the measures and the instructions that you're putting into place on your site is going to be that pre-engagement. And the data showing that a significantly high proportion of visitors, higher than ever before, is looking to websites, to social media feeds, to get information about the site, to make themselves comfortable before they even go and think to attend site as well. So some really great suggestions in there, and a number of which I'm happy to say we're going to be covering off as we go through. So as far as I know, I think most of you are kind of planning to reopen, so we're looking forward, but I'd be really interested to hear again in the chat function, what are you most looking forward to about reopening your site? So your institutions may have been closed for the longest period in their operation, and it might be about you personally going back onto site, or it might just be about the site opening, but what are you looking forward to? It's I know for a number of people, it's going to be, there's a desperation to get back on site, to do what you enjoy doing, to engage with visitors, all those core purposes that you're looking to engage with every day. So just have a quick think now and just pop it in the chat function about what you're most looking forward to. Everyone's taking a bit longer on this one, so you're obviously really thinking about this, or they're going to be very long answers. Seeing people in the flesh. Okay, that's from Ruth there. So yeah, I think actually getting people back in, that these are spaces that are designed to have people in them, that are designed to engage with them. And for those of you who've had the opportunity to be in your spaces when there aren't people in there, there's an emptiness there that feels like it needs to be filled. So I know there's a real keenness to get people back in. Seeing people, volunteers, colleagues and visitors. Yeah, for a lot of people, it's actually just getting back onto site and engaging with those teams that you've spent so long working with, kind of delivering those shared goals. Getting stuck into a couple of projects. I like that one. And I think whether you've been off site, I know everyone's been busy. I think this is one of the things for, I don't know, some of you may be furloughed at the moment, or you may have been furloughed. So you may have kind of had periods where you haven't been working, which can be equally challenging as well. And for those of you who haven't, you probably have been exceptionally busy. So I think one of the expectations is actually this has been a quiet time. I know for many of you, this has actually been an exceptionally busy time. So to get back in and get back to doing the day job, doing the things you love doing, I think it's really important. However, we've got to get reopened first. And part of this session today is about helping you guys and hopefully reducing some of that burden of planning to get those sites back open. Yeah, getting projects that were halted midway through back on track. Seeing colleagues, seeing the building, just getting back into the space. I appreciate some of you may not have been back on site at all over the past 3-4 months. So that's going to be a real joy to actually get back on site. So I don't know if someone's just saying they haven't got the audio. So hopefully everyone can hear me. I see people are nodding. So I think that might be an individual technical issue, but do let me know if you can't hear me. Providing service for our residents, wider general public, give the public quality of life, sense of community. And do you know, anecdotally, and for what I've been reading in the press, it feels like actually the absence does make the heart grow fonder, and a number of people have really missed the opportunity to visit sites such as yours. And there's a pent-up demand there. And also as well, there's been some fantastic engagement going on online, on social media, through various other forums, through community groups, during lockdown that has actually built up some demand in its own right as well. So there will be a lot of people who'll be very keen to come back on site. And our job over the next 4 hours is going to be to make sure that we do that in a way that makes them comfortable, and they're keen to get back on site. Let's make sure they're comfortable with the COVID restrictions that are in place, and we can get them back on site. So great. Thank you for all the input on the chat. And like I say, as we go through the session, please continue to use it as we go through, ask questions, and put through any comments that you may have. So let's set the context very broadly here, just over a few minutes. You guys have all been living and breathing this one, but let's just kind of let's take a moment now just to kind of reflect on where we are. So I've taken this one actually from we're going to talk a bit about the National Museum Directors Council guidance. I know some of you attended a session that was run last week, I think, by AIM, who were kind of talking about who were involved in the guidance setting. This is actually some detail that I've kind of paraphrased slightly, but it's come from them around this broad timeline for reopening. I thought it was quite a good kind of sense place for us to think about where we are at the moment. So effectively, during June, on the 23rd of June, the Prime Minister announced that museums can reopen from the 4th of July. And I think a very important message, a fairly early on one, was a large portion of the public assumed, therefore, that museums would all open on the 4th of July. As we all know, this isn't the case. And fundamentally, I will be advocating right the way through this training course, you have to be absolutely comfortable before you reopen your doors. And hence, as various institutions do this, the phasing and reopening of museums is going to take place over the summer and potentially into the autumn, and maybe even into early 2021. So we will see them opening in waves and in various phases. So we're in July now, we're kind of in the middle of this one. So fundamentally, we're seeing some organisations reopen. I'll talk later about a tracker that I've been publishing online, and we're kind of tracking how institutions are reopening. I think what was quite surprising was the number who didn't open straight away. I think there was an expectation there'd be more, but for me, that's quite reassuring, because that means everybody's putting a great deal of thought into how they reopen and making sure they do it in the right way. A number of institutions are actually waiting to see what the sector does. Does public appetite return before they think? And obviously, we've mentioned before, while the furlough scheme still exists, for some institutions, it might make sense for them to not reopen fully until furlough is ended as a scheme. So museums are preparing to reopen, most with reduced capacity, and we'll talk more about that. And also that we're seeing a phased reopening. So we talk about reopening of sites, and as you guys are probably all planning, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be up and running straight away, that you may open your site physically in phases. You may reopen the types of activities you do. So for example, for most of you, we're probably not expecting events business to come back maybe this year, maybe not into next year. School visits, maybe not returning until the autumn. Some are talking about next year as well. Although I know a number of institutions are starting to get inquiries about school visits for the autumn. So there's a demand there. And again, another factor that needs to be quite considered. And as well as we'll talk about today, you've all got your very own local context settings, structures, you're all organised in very different ways. These will all have an impact on how you reopen. So what does the rest of the year look like? This is the very high level picture. In August, we're expecting more to reopen, particularly those who are looking to make the most of getting the end of the summer season, the school holidays, or kind of school holidays inverted commas this year, because it's a slightly different setup, but looking to make the most of those. But still with a number, looking to move from September through to October. Again, setting is a key one. I know for a number of institutions based in city centres, they are particularly mindful about the public's reluctance to go back on public transport, and they're waiting for that to die back. So actually some city centres and some of the largest institutions are the ones delaying their reopening the longest. However, again, we are hearing anecdotally as well that this could be quite a good time in the end of the summer for those in more rural locations and those who aren't so heavily reliant on public transport, as visitors who aren't travelling internationally will be staycationing and looking for opportunities to go and visit their sites and engage in their culture in a slightly different way. And then winter 2020, this is where we may hit a point where for some institutions, if they haven't been able to open by the autumn, their model may not sustain them through the winter, so they may actually be moving to spring 2021. So for a number of institutions, we may be thinking about an opening into next year. So there's going to be no single moment, no cliff edge where everything opens up, but it is going to be happening in phases and in a regional basis as well. And something that we will touch on today as well is the preparation that may be needed for local lockdowns. We've already seen one in Leicester. At that point, that happened before museums were allowed to open, but in theory, if they had been reopened, they would have had to lock down alongside other functions as well. So all of our replanning, it's the thing I hate to be talking about now, but I think we need to be pragmatic and go that we may need to prepare and learn from what's happened over the last 4 months for some potentially short-term lockdowns, hopefully. So where are we at the moment? One thing I would say, here's some questions that we'll be asking. Some of these kind of tune in with the comments you were putting earlier. Will we be opening the doors to a safe building? Where do we get guidance from? How visitors and staff feel about entering the new safety measures? I'm putting these up here because hopefully many of you are looking at these now and going, yes, these are my questions. And the reassurance is that these are the questions that every institution in the UK is thinking about now, big or small. And I'm going to kind of put my hands up here. I probably shouldn't do this at the beginning of the training session. We go, we haven't got the answers to all of these at the moment. However, people are working out solutions, and we can talk about those today. There is guidance in place. There is structure. And there is always going to be an element that you can look to others to give you ideas and inspiration. But ultimately, you are going to have to risk assess and work to your own local context and come up with your own solutions. But let's give you some ideas today, and let's try and help each other as a community to share some of this best practice. So this is just some data from the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions. We're going to come onto this particularly actually in the next session, but I thought I'd flag this one up. This is actually from their May one. There's been a more recent one about what the public are thinking. If any of you haven't had a chance to, I would really encourage you to go and have a look at the ALVA data. So they're surveying visitors, and this is quite general, so you've obviously got to take it in a context that this is kind of looking at a broader picture, and also for visitor attractions broader than just museums. But to have a think about what it is, what are the concerns of visitors, and it actually acts as a real kind of a good framework potentially for thinking about what you need to think about coming back into the buildings. So we've gone down to real practical measures. So our focus points, we're going to be looking at things like toilets and staff welfare and protection and cleaning regimes and cafes and shops, because these are the big items. This is what your visitors will be concerned about. They are concerned about how clean the toilets are and how they're being cleaned. So we need to think about all of these. And the data is showing that depending on where you are, there is some reluctance from visitors, but as the surveys come out, we're seeing an improvement. And ultimately, as other sectors come online and the public get more comfortable with measures that are put into place, I think it's going to make them more comfortable about coming back into museums and other spaces. And the one thing I would take away, and we'll come on to it again from the ALVA data, is the public as a whole have very high levels of confidence in the ability of museums to provide safe spaces. And they're very confident in the ability of museum staff and volunteers to act in an appropriate way. Their actual concern is the rest of the public, which is an interesting one. And so we need to kind of be thinking about this and how we manage those expectations as well. And also without creating environments where we have to really heavily police our visitors, which I think is a point we don't really want to get to. So here's just some of the ALVA data. Again, worth looking at. I'm just kind of flagging this one here. But what are visitors most concerned about? They split between indoors and outdoors. I know some of you have quite outdoor-based sites. But for indoor, obviously, the indoor spaces are more of a concern. They're more confined. This is the guidance that's coming out. What are they concerned about? It's cafes, restaurants, indoor seating, toilets, the touching of interactive exhibits, indoor events, guided tours. So this becomes quite a useful checklist to start thinking about what your visitors might be concerned about when you come back onto site and what they might not be as well. And you see shops are fairly low down the list. And I think I'd be gauging from that actually, because they're probably more comfortable about being in a retail environment. They have been in shops. Shops are reopened now. And they've been going into shops potentially throughout lockdown, so they're more comfortable with those environments. So we'll come back to some of these in terms of the solutions as we go through the session. And as I said before, I'll be pointing you towards some really good sources of data as well, because we've only got 4 hours in total for this session. One of the other things I'm going to be talking about is risk assessments. So I'm sure you all know what risk assessments are, and I'm sure you already have risk assessments. Ultimately, the tool that you're going to be applying here is risk assessment tools. You should already have some in place. A number of you do. and just kind of reiterating, you have a legal responsibility to protect your workers and others from risk to their health and safety. So think about your work. And in this term here, this is from the NMDC guidance. When we talk about workers, we're also thinking about volunteers and anybody who's active in providing those services on your site. Also, you need to make sure that if you have contractors or subcontractors working on your site, you need to be considering them, or at least ensuring that the companies that are operating them are thinking about those as well. In theory, a risk assessment isn't about creating huge amounts of paperwork, and it's about being pragmatic and identifying sensible measures. The HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, has a lot of guidance available. You can go on there to their website. One thing I would say on here, I'm just going to say to kind of put it in context, if you have fewer than 5 workers, you don't have to write anything down as part of your risk assessment. However, I would still be encouraging you to do written risk assessments if you can. This is just setting the broader legal expectation around the risk assessment piece. And also as well, what we're seeing is risk assessments are becoming incredibly useful tools and a way of communicating with visitors. And a number of sites are publishing these already. Another thing I would say about risk assessments, you probably have risk assessments already in place. So what I've spoken to a number of people over recent weeks is everyone's kind of creating brand new risk assessments from blank templates for COVID from scratch. See, there's some good examples that are coming through the chat function there. So here's some links. Look at your existing risk assessments. Look how you can develop those. You may want to develop a COVID specific one, but when it comes to health and safety, a number of the impacts and measures that you need to put in place to respond to COVID are measures that you may have been considering previously for other health and safety risks potentially. So you don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. I would encourage you to look at the work you've already done. And it's already coming through the chat function. As stated, many organisations are publishing their COVID risk assessments. So I think there's a link on there to Bletchley Park. Here's one from Kew Gardens, just as a kind of an example, where actually they're publishing quite detailed risk assessments online. So what I'm not advocating is you just go and cut and paste from Kew Gardens, from Bletchley, from anywhere else, and take that as your risk assessment. However, if you are time limited or resource limited, or you haven't undertaken risk assessments, they are a great source of information to provide you with a framework to think about how your risk assessment could look, and also as a prompt for either risks that you might not have thought about, and also measures that they may be looking to implement that you haven't thought about either. So I think they can be an incredibly useful source of information. So there's a couple in the link here. So this is one for Kew Gardens. What's happening? So this Kew Gardens one, they're actually publishing online. There's quite a lot of organisations that are doing this. They are being encouraged to. Kew Gardens one, you have to look for a bit. The links there at the bottom of the screen. I'll send some of these links to you at the end of the session so you can go to them directly. One of the reasons they're doing this as well is because for some visitors, they really want to see that organisations are risk assessing and they're really thinking about their visitors. And by publishing your risk assessments, there's a real opportunity to do this. And your risk assessments should contain quite practical. They should be written in such a way that is communicating, able to be communicated to your visitors. They shouldn't be complicated documents. There's no reason why they should be containing any commercial or sensitive information. Obviously, you want to be mindful of that if you are publishing them in the public domain. But here's another opportunity for you to engage your visitors, if you have a website, that is. Or it may be something that you just have available and expect that you may get inquiries from visitors to understand what measures you have put in place. So your risk assessment can be a multi-purpose tool for doing this. And hopefully, as we go through the sessions in the next few hours, you'll also be getting ideas and suggestions for some of the mitigations and risks that you may not have thought of that will help populate your risk assessment as well. So if you're not already doing so, your risk assessment, and I'm going to keep using the word risk assessment, sorry, you're getting probably a bit of a scratch record there. They're an incredibly useful tool and a framework for all of your planning as you go forward. So in terms of this context setting, as we come to the end of this section, when this started, we may have been planning for when normal will return. We're now planning for a new normal. So what I mean by this is your solutions need to be sustainable. There's not a line in the sand or a date coming up where we think this is all going to go away. Estimates kind of vary about how long we're going to be dealing with COVID. A vaccine isn't around the corner. So in theory, we will be living with COVID restrictions in place. They may change, as they already have done in recent weeks. But when you're thinking about the solutions you put in place, think about how they will last long term. How will they last over the course of a year? So you may have a solution that says, well, actually, we can get people queuing outside of this building, or this is where we can control the queues. will that work in February when it's below zero and it's chucking down with rain or snow? How sustainable are your solutions? And so it may not be that you have to build solutions that fix all those problems, but you may want to think about how flexible your solutions can be. Another example I would give is guidance around 2-meter distancing. A lot of people spend a lot of money on signage. That's now changed, although we will come to that later. It still technically is 2 meters distancing, but you might want to think about signage and how flexible that can be as well going forward. And fundamentally, the expectations and concerns of our staff, volunteers and visitors have changed and will change further. Are we ready to respond? So we've got to be thinking about that the whole time. A lot of organisations are really engaging well with their staff, with their volunteers, with their visitors before they reopen. This will have to be an ongoing process. You will have to constantly think about how you engage with, with all of those groups and address those concerns as and when they come up. I don't think anybody, if your visitors aren't comfortable, they just won't come to site. And if your staff and your volunteers aren't happy, this may manifest itself in other ways as well. And I'm sure nobody wants to be making those groups unhappy. So I particularly like this quote, and it says, "Museums are like parks, spaces in which the individual experience can intertwine with the public space of being together. In the coming months, as a society, we face the challenge to find a new positive balance between personal freedom and the care for our relationship with others." So this is, I just quite like this quote. I think we need to be thinking about this, that we are managing spaces, whether internal or external. We're going to have to develop those in different ways as we go forward. But can we do that in positive ways? Can we make sure that we maintain the experience as much as possible? So I just really like this quote, so I just wanted to put that one up there. And now we're going to go on to guidance and sources of information. I'm assuming that a lot of you are fully aware of the guidance that's out there. I'm just going to go through and pull out what I think are a few really interesting points from them. The guidance is all available online. We'll share links with those. So we're going to do a fairly quick canter through, but do ask questions, and either now or later on if there's bits of the guidance you think are unclear, and we will try and have a conversation around those as we go through. So there's a lot of guidance out there. So there's the broader government guidance. The government started to issue sector-specific guidance, and also they've been collaborating with bodies. We've got advisory bodies. So within this section here in the middle, we've got the guidance from places like the National Museum Directors Council and others. Also, there's a lot of webinars, training sessions like this one, social media feeds. There's a lot of information being shared amongst peers as well. So there's a whole range of sources of information. So the one thing we're not short of at the moment is information and guidance. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the guidance is fairly generic, and so that's why we're going to try and come through with some actual examples today and come through. So there's some more coming through on the chat group. So there's been the AIM checklist is on there, which is another really good source of information. So we won't dwell on these too heavily, but I just want to go through and just make sure that we're all clear as we set the framework for our conversation over the coming days, which will often refer back to these. So here's some of the links. Sorry, we can send these around later, so you don't have to try and copy these down, but this is just to say that there's some really good AIM guidance there, the National Museum Directors Council, and the UK government guidance for museums and galleries, which is effectively taken from the NMDC guidance. And as was discussed last week, that was a process that involved a number of bodies, including UK government, and I know that there's some very specific government guidance wording went into that as well, so it's a real collaboration between the two. But the NMDC guidance is a really good starting point, so I would encourage you, if you haven't already looked at that document, I think it's quite useful, and we will refer to that at various points throughout the sessions today. Again, sorry, I'm just reiterating a point I already said about the ALVA measuring data. This has been incredibly useful, I know, for a number of institutions in their planning. And also it's really helpful when engaging with other stakeholders, whether that be trustees, senior management teams, volunteers, to get a real sense of what the public are thinking about coming back onto sites. As I said before, this is very generic and covering a large number of attractions across the UK. And we need to be thinking about that in terms of how we respond to those, but quite a useful starting point. And also potentially a useful starting point if you are also thinking to engage with your visitors. A number of sites are doing surveys, social media engagement, direct community engagement. They give a really good framework for doing that as well. So I'm just going to canter through the UK government guidance. You all would have seen this one. We're not going to go too heavily on it, but I just think it's worth reiterating, because fundamentally, whatever organisation you work for in whatever sector, this is what the UK government is currently saying about how they think you should be responding. So this should be the baseline for all of us when we're thinking about what our planning is. So I've said it already, carry out a risk assessment, HSE guidance. So just kind of Google HSE guidance and directly COVID as well, and they'll come back with some very useful information on there. Consult with your workers or trade unions. So I think there's a real key one actually, which is don't forget to consult in your planning. Particularly a lot of your staff are the ones who have the real expertise about how your sites operate, particularly those who are working in front of house roles. Those are the ones you want to engage with. I appreciate that may be challenging, particularly if some of those individuals on furlough and you're thinking about reopening, but where possible and in the right context between furloughing and return to work, in terms of return to full opening, do try and engage with them, get them involved in the process. They will have really interesting insights, and they will probably understand better than most how visitors will potentially interact with any new measures you'll put in place. And as I said, share your risk assessment with workforce and your website. So the government is suggesting you put it on your website, you don't have to, but really kind of share your thinking. And this is really important for your volunteers and your staff. Get them on board so they understand why you're implementing any particular measures. So again, back to basics, as it hasn't actually changed that much. Hand washing and surface cleaning is one of the key measures. And hand washing, and actually in many, we'll touch on this later, but in many settings, hand washing is actually more effective, or has been shown to be by a number of studies, than actually wearing gloves and other protective measures. It's the one thing that we should be continuing to encourage people to do. And you need to think about that in terms of providing your visitors with the opportunity to do this, and also your staff and your volunteers. So, and obviously frequent cleaning, disinfecting, enhancing cleaning for busy areas. We'll go into all this in detail, but this is what the government is saying. So we're applying this in areas right the way through across all sectors. Helping people work from home. So I don't know how relevant this is already. This is central government advice. We'll go through their key points. And they still are encouraging people where possible, if they don't need to be on site, that if where possible, you allow them to work from home. And equipment. So we just need to be thinking about that as well. And the reason I flagged this one up is the final bullet point, which is looking after their physical and mental well-being. So do think about your staff. This has been a very difficult time for everybody on this call, and for all those people you work with and everybody who's been working in the sector. Really think about this. I'm not the mental health specialist, but there's some really great guidance out there. And I think we're going to link to some of it later on. I'd really encourage you to think about your staff and also that transition as well, that it's kind of anecdotally it's come up. Just because staff have been furloughed, furlough doesn't mean they've been on holiday for a period of time. For some of those, that's been an incredibly difficult period. Working from home has been incredibly challenging for a number of people who've had to work in very difficult environments and adjust their working, potentially around family and other commitments. And also, we just don't know, you don't know if people have been directly impacted by COVID and other issues during that time. So just really think about your staff. And I couldn't encourage that any more than this. So it is still maintain 2 metre social distancing where possible, although obviously the guidance is now that can be reduced where mitigations are in place. So it doesn't have to be 2 metres, but a number of institutions around the UK are still maintaining this. The Royal Academy in London reopened last week, and they are sticking for the indefinite future to 2 metres. And they think it's the right thing to do in terms of encouraging the right behaviours around their sites, but also in reassuring their visitors. However, I appreciate for a number of you that the 2 metre distancing is one of the barriers to you reopening, and so you have to think very carefully about the mitigations as well. But obviously, this is central government guidance, and again, they acknowledge already guidance has been right the way through lockdown that you can't always keep people 2 metres apart, so you need to risk assess particular activities. And particularly think about your staff and ways of working, how you can think about those. So one that came up in another session I was involved in was object handling, and about the balance there, that some objects you need to handle with 2 people, but you can't keep 2 metres apart. And is there a risk assessment there about actually the risks of those objects if you try and implement different ways of working in terms of object handling? So it's something to be thought about. But there are other mitigations you can put in place, and you just need to think about those as well. The 2 meter distancing isn't the only mitigation you can put in. So, as we've got a lot to do, I'm talking fairly quickly, but I would encourage you, I said there's some really good guidance out there. A number of places like AIM, I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with, museum associations, they're actually really good focal points for pulling together information, and they link through to a number of these. So they're great starting points, depending on where you're coming from. So particularly for the UK sector. They've done some sterling work, a number of these organisations, and those that I haven't actually listed on here. These are just a couple of screenshots, and I'd really encourage you to engage with them. And also, as well, I know it's a really small thing, but maybe kind of give some feedback to them as well. If you really benefit from them, it never hurts to tweet with a nice message or drop an email. And just there's a lot of people in these organisations who've been working incredibly hard during this time as well. So we're going to touch on now on the NMDC guidance. Again, this is a lengthy document, an incredibly useful one for the sector that's been in development for quite some time. In fairness to everybody involved, I heard, and it was held up by Cabinet Office in terms of its release, so it should have been out a bit sooner. But a lot of people have worked really hard, and I'd encourage you to go and look at this, download the PDF, and sit there one evening with a cup of tea, and you will definitely get something out of this. So I'm not going to go through this at length because we simply don't have the time. However, I thought this was really useful. They've set out their 9 considerations for reopening. So I'm putting it up on the screen now, but I'm also kind of pointing you to it, just to think about things that need to be in place before museums, any museums ready to reopen, and they've got all of their members feeding into this. And one thing as well I would say, to reiterate, although it's the National Museum Directors Council, this has been written to be used by the entire museum sector. So this isn't just guidance for national museums. Obviously, some of it will be applicable depending on your size, but there's really useful information there for any site. So number 1 is already, that's a tick in the box. So the government says we can reopen. Can reopen doesn't mean say you have to reopen. And I think what's really important is number 2, it goes straight off and saying security of workers, public and sites sufficiently maintained. So before you do anything else, and as keen as we are to get the buildings open, and as keen as we are to care for the collections and historic sites, we've got to make sure people are safe. This is where we are at the moment. So individually, if you are responsible for taking this decision or advising those who are, you have to have a confidence that you're happy that you've done everything you can to make sure your site is safe to reopen. So I'd empower you with that thought to say, make yourselves comfortable and confident. And hopefully from the sessions today and engagement with your peers, you will get confidence in terms of what you can do, because the risk is to go the other way and never reopen because the measures become so costly or so burdensome. There has to be a degree of pragmatism in this, and hopefully this is what we're going to get to in the coming sessions. Your workforce can be safety and well-being, importantly. People have to be happy and comfortable to be in the workplace. That public safety can be assured. That you can actually adapt your buildings and processes. So for some of you, particularly if you've got very constrained sites, this may be a difficulty, and this may be one of the reasons you're delaying reopening. That the business case supports reopening. That unfortunately, we've all got to make sure that we keep our heads above water. There's been some great sources of funding, but a number of organisations have been significantly impacted during this process. And unfortunately, we're going to be dealing with the impacts of those for the coming years. We've got to make sure that the business cases make sense. For example, you could throw a lot of front of house staff, volunteers at providing solutions around COVID. That just might not be cost efficient. We need to be thinking about sensible solutions as we go through. That visitors are actually going to come back, that the model works. There appears to be a demand, but I can't speak for every region in the UK. And we need to think about how that's happening, and we need to model those. That transport systems can support people coming in. So it's all very well and good reopening your sites, but if your workers, if your volunteers can't get to site, that's going to provide a barrier. We need to think about that as well. And also to think about the local context of what's going on around you in your community, in other organisations that are around. So that's a real kind of, this is the high level bullet points. We're going to cover off a number of these, but I really would encourage you to go to the NMDC guidance. So again, this is just their summary. Sorry, slightly poor screenshot there. So the things that museums should be thinking about. So this is another way of expressing this, but this is directly from their document. And these are the things that we need to be thinking about. So I would encourage you to be thinking about these as your starting point, as potentially informing your risk assessments, or also having conversations with other stakeholders, whether it be your staff or others, to think about some of the key issues. So this is what they're flagging up. Obviously, the session has been recorded. We're going through going through some of these quite quickly, so you will have time to go back through some of the content. But you can either through the chat function or contact me directly, and we can share any information that we have gone through. So, summary in terms of guidance and sources of information. I've just gone through in about 15 minutes and covered off a whole range of guidance that's out there. All I want you to take away from this session is the guidance is there. There's some really useful information. Go and find the documents, but equally go and contact people. A number of the support organisations for the sector are really keen and willing to help. Obviously, we're here. We've got some great people who are kind of actively working in the chat function. They're giving you information even while I'm talking. People really want to help each other. It's one of the real positives, I think, from this period we're going through. So don't be afraid to ask. And generally, as a rule of thumb, I think in any setting, and now more than ever, if you've got a question and you don't quite know how to resolve it, other people probably have that question too. And the best way to come to a solution is to collaborate, to share information and get that best practice around. I'm really keen that we share as much best practice as possible to just avoid duplication. We're all under a lot of constraints. Let's be efficient in how we reopen and try and do it in a consistent way as possible. And also as well, we talked about some very museum specific guidance. As you'll see here, there's a lot of guidance for other sectors. So if you think about all the guidance that's out there around retail environments, go and look at that, because that's really applicable to potentially retail environments or just to your broader operating environment. And I think you need to think about your visitors and about the measures they're being asked to utilise. Again, another example I'll give from London is a number of the organisations are requiring their visitors to wear face coverings, but they've deliberately done that on the understanding that the majority of their visitors would have travelled on public transport, around 95%, and would have already been wearing face coverings. So they know they can make those steps, and they're working with their broader visitor expectations. So you may also want to be thinking about those broader expectations from other sectors. If people are comfortable doing something in a retail setting, they'll probably be comfortable doing it in a museum setting as well. So you might want to think about how those cross over. And even today, I see that I think the guidance has come out around face coverings is going to be, Boris has used his typical kind of woolly words, but I think there's kind of mandatory. I think there may actually be financial penalties associated with it. I did see in one news article. So already we're seeing another area changing. So if face coverings are becoming required in other settings, people may be more open to wearing them in a museum setting because they're having to wear them. They'll be carrying them with them if they need to go shopping. So keep an eye on all of those. So identifying the key challenges. And an opportunity for you to all get involved as we come towards the end of this first hour of the session. Using the chat function, I'm going to show you some images of parts of institution and organisation. Here's these are non-UK ones. This is the Silesian Museum, which I think is in Poland. In the chat function, I just want you to identify what you think some of the issues would be. All these pictures are taken pre-COVID. And what is it you think the visitors may be looking at, or your staff? What are the areas where you think there may be issues in relation to COVID that may need measures put in place? So I'll give you a chance to have a look at the picture and just pop into the chat function if there's anything that pops into your mind that would have to change about this setting. Now, see sneeze screen. So this is something we're seeing quite commonly used, the perspex screens in a number of settings. Yeah, no shield. Touch screens, again, in the last few years, we've seen a proliferation of the use of touchscreen technology. So this is one here where they're kind of encouraging visitors probably to book in, to put information in. This is another contact point. So we're kind of going back and we want to actually reduce contact points. So how can that be replicated? So queue paying by card. So in terms of the touchscreen, so this is about visitors actually coming to buy tickets. So one of the measures that we're seeing implemented is actually pre-booking and all this ticket information. So this whole ticketing process being done before a visitor even gets to site to reduce the need to come to a desk. No queuing system. So you can see here there's potentially 4 points. Even if you had a queuing system, you may have visitors much closer than 2 meters apart. Yeah, so there's no floor markings, directions, social issuing. So at the moment, this is just a free-for-all. And this is one of the real difficulties we are going to have as a sector as we approach solutions for these. We have strived, particularly in recent years, to be as open and welcoming as possible and to allow our visitors to kind of come close to us and engage. And we're going to have to try and put in measures that make sure that we still maintain that sense of connection with them without physically distancing too much. So okay, yeah, the Art Fund has got the free ticketing system. So I know this is something that's been talked about a bit, and a number of people have asked questions on previous sessions saying if we don't have a ticketing system. By the way, we'll come to ticketing. So a lot of people are using pre-booking and ticketing systems. The guidance doesn't say you have to. It's just kind of, it's there suggesting it's one way to measure these, and it's not always suitable. So hand sanitizers. One thing I'd also point out from this image, I think, is potentially that the physical distancing of the staff. So for a number of you, you may not be able to physically distance staff. So there may be other mitigations. So if you're not doing so already, kind of putting staff and volunteers in bubbles, in shift teams. So you've got the same groups working together all the time, again, to minimize risk. Potentially, if you can't physically distance them, it's enhancing cleaning within those areas. Yeah, so a number of measures there. So thanks for your input on the chat one. There's going to be a couple more of these. I'd just be interested to get your thoughts. So this one is a cloakroom. This one's from the Rijksmuseum. I don't know if many of you have cloakrooms, but just I'd be interested to know what you think are the potential issues here in this setting. And by the way, in case you hadn't realised, what I'm trying to encourage you to hear is really kind of look and feel spaces. I think in terms of risk assessments, they aren't always exercises you can just go and lock yourself in a room and do. Where possible, if you can get to site, I think it's really useful to kind of walk the site, kind of put yourselves in the shoes of visitors. Use it as an opportunity to engage with some of your teams, with some of those staff who work in those areas, and just put yourself in that space and feel about how that could work. So Fergus says, just about everything here is a problem. Yep, I wouldn't disagree with that one. Belongings, touching, source. So queue management. So queue management in any area is something we're looking at. Perspex screens, distancing of the visitors, touching other belongings. So we'll come to the data tracking that we'll look at. And if any of you have cloakrooms, cloakrooms seem to be the one area that we're seeing consistently closed on a number of sites, that the organisations just aren't being able to get their heads around how to reopen cloakrooms, because you're physically putting your staff in contact with objects that any member of the public could be touching. This becomes a real kind of a real risk point, particularly around staff welfare and your visitors as well. But there are, again, mitigations in place. So what we're seeing is a number of organisations suggesting to visitors before they come to site to only wear a light coat, to not bring luggage with them, particularly if you're in a city centre location. You may have visitors who are using luggage. To think about those that come into place. So there are opportunities here, lockers, and just think about how you can manage these in slightly different ways. But cloakrooms are something that we haven't really got our head around yet. I haven't seen any great examples about anyone who has got them open, but again, as we go through, you guys have got some great experience. So if you've seen a good example for any challenges that I put up, then please do put them into the chat function. Again, this one here, another one. So we've got a cafe setting. It'd be interesting, anybody on the chat room, if you just kind of pop through any of the particular issues you see in this setting, in this image. Cafes have been highlighted, particularly through the Alva data, as being one of the real areas. I appreciate that you may not all have cafes, but this probably goes for other areas as well, in retail, any space we go through. Handing over the food counter, yep. Social distancing. So I think there's quite an interesting social distancing, and one that we see here that, again, another trend has been either through deliberate action or by the necessity that you haven't got a very big site, is that we've got a lot of multi-purpose areas. So you may have cafes that are also a route, you may have shops that are also a route. So this appears to be a through route as well. And this just adds a real complexity to these areas where actually, if you're trying to maintain social distancing, is it great that, I mean, the museum model for the past few years is actually you want to channel people through your shop on the way out as close to as possible. Is that something we actually want to be doing going forward? And these are some of the routes we might need to be thinking about. So this one here, so I think the Rijksmuseum is pretty good, big. So the question is this the entrance route? I think this is an entrance into the Rijksmuseum. I think they have multiple routes that come through, or at least into an outdoor area. And then a table in the front door. Yeah, so tables. You look at the seating areas. Everybody's very close together. Yeah, cafes are a really interesting one, and we've seen some quite an inclusive museum where they had mannequins dressed in period costumes. Distancing. Museum, but I put it up there as anybody see any problems with this in a post-COVID world? I like the exclamation marks there from Tessa. Yeah, this photo makes me feel really uncomfortable just looking at it. But if any of you have ever had the opportunity to be at the British Museum, I was going to say at busy times, but any times, I think this is the Rosetta Stone they're next to. This is not unfamiliar. Yeah, everyone, there's no space. Everyone's crowded together. And then I think we need to, too close to each other's display case. I think you need to look at what the potential mitigations are for this. So at a really high level, and you can't do this for every object, but if on your site you have particular star objects, you may need to think about social distancing around that one object or those few objects. You can't do this for every object or every display case or every interactive, but for some of them you may need to. One of the potential mitigations is moving the interpretation away from the object. So people reading the interpretation don't have to directly need to the object. You can potentially create some interpretation if you have those star objects to allow people to spread out and engage with the object and the interpretation within the same area. Yeah, so there's an example there actually given in the chat function about the Book of Kells in Dublin, again, conveyor belt style. And again, I think this is a real balance, and not everybody's wanting to get the Tower of London experience where you physically end up on an escalator and you're just going to whiz past the crown jewels at speed. But how do we manage this? I think there's things to do. I see this actually as a real potential opportunity from this as we break through that. And I know a lot of the feedback I'm getting from colleagues and from friends at visiting sites, they're really enjoying visiting sites at much lower densities. And maybe it's an opportunity for us to review how we operate museums and galleries and go, actually, this picture here, is this acceptable? Is this something we want to achieve? Can our post-COVID measures actually improve visitor experience? And this is something I mentioned earlier, and going, actually, if you were here and you were given the opportunity to socially distance, to have more space from the object, could that be a real positive in terms of what we're doing? And like I said, I don't think it's every object, potentially star objects on your site. So this is a key one. So this one here, just an image, again, just to put up there as a historic house museum. So this is just an image, but I really just flagging up what people think may be the potential images when, if you're working in, this may be a historic house or a building, sites that are constrained by their nature. What do we think may be the potential challenges with this? Lifts, yeah, we're going to come on to lifts. So social distancing in lifts, and then about how you then manage this. Some sites are saying that they're only allowing visitors who absolutely need to use lifts to use them. Because for most lifts, you wouldn't maintain 2 meters, maybe even 1.5 or 1 meter, so you can have one person lift at a time or one family group. Lift buttons, yep, that's another key point. So again, contact points, social distancing in small rooms on stairs, managing visitor flow. Ideal world, people would like to do a kind of one-way route around the sites. That might not always be possible. What we are seeing on some sites as part of their phase reopening, that if for those particularly in historic houses and smaller buildings, if you have a room where you need to go into and there's only one way in and one way out, if they can't manage social distancing, some of these rooms are being closed and they're not part of the initial phase reopening until they're getting comfortable with the site. So you may want to think about phasing the physical reopening of your internal spaces, and you may not be able to do this. However, I always would advocate that you engage with your visitors and that you make sure that they are comfortable with all of the measures you're putting in place, and that they may be aware that they might not be able to access all the site. We're actually seeing that most visitors are being fairly supportive. They're grateful the site's reopening. They understand the challenges, particularly if you're able to communicate those. Managing visitor numbers in each space. So this is one we're definitely going to come on to, which is, do you manage your visitor capacity as an entire building, or does that have to be per space? And then how would you physically manage in any individual room? This example we see here, you may need 6 volunteers or front of house staff just to manage each of those rooms individually and manage people in and out. That probably isn't feasible. So it's a lot about relying on visitors to do the right thing in these spaces with some kind of oversight. And we'll definitely come on to that, particularly in the session later this week. So we're just coming to the end of this one now, just about on time, I think, to take our 5-minute break. Again, we've gone through a real canter there. I'm still here. Happy to take questions on the chat function. We can, particularly maybe during the break or at the end of the session today, if there's any topics we've gone through really quickly and you're like, oh, I really want to talk about this, let me know sooner rather than later, and we can try and feed that in. If we're not already covering it in the further sessions, we can look to incorporate that one. But now you've got a 5-minute break, so I think we're returning in 5 minutes. We're going to start our case study with Rob from Norton Priory. Yeah, go make yourself a cup of tea, have a break, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Okay, so we're going to start the session back with Rob Sanderson-Thomas, who's joined us from Norton Priory, who's going to give us a case study about how it's going from reopening on the 4th of July. So thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Kay. So I just want to start by saying all museums are very different. So this is what we found in our museum. Hopefully it's useful. I'm sure you've already been discussing this lots, but one of the key things is to start at the very beginning, which in this case is the COVID-19 secure risk assessment. So we undertook that for the whole site. We've used that to make sure we have everything in place that we need to safely reopen. I would say at this point, make sure you leave yourself lots of time to order PPE, because some of the supply times are a bit fluid, shall we say. I was thinking about the best way to go through this, and I thought about 5 M's. So people need to be mobile, they need to be able to get to you and move around safely. You need to think about your income, so you need to think about money. You need to think about your key supporters, so you need to think about members. You need to think about marketing, so that reminding versus forgetting thing. If you stay shut for a long time, people might forget you're there, and then you'll have a big cost to try and pull those audiences back in. And you need to think about how to make the new normal feel natural. So that's about modifications. So think about how people will reach you. For us at Norton Priory, this was easier for once, because we don't have public transport. We're not served directly by it, which is usually a problem, but in this case made reopening a little bit easier for us. We're fortunate we have quite a large museum space inside, so we do have sufficient space, but we also thought about some changes to the layout, and I'll come on to that later. Some of the things that have come up in our thinking about it is we're by a cycle track. We know lots of people have been buying bikes, so we've been thinking about cycle storage. Layout changes, so our shop has changed. We've pushed the units back to make more space, and we've introduced one-way systems where it's practical for us to do so. So thinking about money, financial planning is key. Where does your income come from? So I think there's 2 key questions here. Certainly for us was, can we afford to open, but also can we afford to stay closed? So I did a piece of work to try and understand the tipping point between where it was worth us being open versus staying closed. I think we have just about got there. So far it's early days. We just open Saturdays and Sundays now because there isn't the level of demand. So I think another key point for me is be prepared to change what you've put in place and just to replan around that. Include, when you think about the impact of the confidence of people who are coming to visit you. We found that seems to be quite a big issue. And also for us, we've been doing online ticket sales for the first time. I'm not sure all our customers are terribly familiar with that. The ticket price, we put our prices up. We were expecting some comeback from that. As yet, touch wood, we haven't had it. Members, so for us, we do have paying members, but you may have other stakeholders that are expecting you to be open. The world can't and hopefully won't stay in lockdown forever. So we were keeping an eye on neighbouring attractions. We've got a lot of outside space, so places that were opening their outside spaces. Nearby, we're starting to raise expectations amongst our audience for us to reopen. So that was one of our decisions as well. And I think the really important thing is, how do you make it safe without it being a scary experience for people to come back? I was speaking to one of our volunteers and asking her what she found from some of the places she'd been to open, where they have lots of outside space that she'd been to visit. And she was saying that one of them she'd really liked because they'd done it really well. The other one she didn't like because there were loads of signs saying you can't come here, you can't do this, turn around, it's one way. So she found that made it quite scary. So I had to strike a little bit of a sort of easy way to support that. We've also got volunteers itching to return. So we've been doing some trial work with volunteers. which seems to be going well, but realistically our volunteers are probably not going to be starting to return until next month now. Just some hints and tips. So wherever you see the light bulbs, that's some of my hints and tips. So use social media to gauge visitor expectation, share as much information as you can online, and trial new ways of working to enable return of volunteers. For marketing, think about how you'll spread the word. I'll be honest, we're pretty much just down to our website, which isn't great, and our Facebook page are our key sort of ways to get the word out. Not ideal. We've managed to get a bit of newspaper publicity as well, but I think having other places you can advertise would be useful. Some places may have more access to that than we do. Think about how your offer will change. So at Norton Priory, one of our big offers in the summer is events and activities, which frankly we can't do in the current world. I'm looking at ways we can do something similar but different, but that will impact why people might come and visit us. We've actually already had some members saying, well, if you're not doing those offers, we don't want to continue to pay to be a member of Norton Priory. So it's worth thinking about why people come to you and how COVID-19 is going to affect what you can offer. Some key activities are going to take place, and this is going to affect our revenue for us. I'm sure lots of you are the same. School visits are really big. Weddings, we typically would have weddings this time of year. They've all been moved back, either some later this year, most have moved into next year. So that's affecting our income for this financial year. Corporate bookings, although ironically, I've just had an inquiry for an outdoor corporate booking today. So there are still people out there looking to have some kind of meetings. So again, marketing, social media channels to spread the word, and other influential people you can invite to see the changes you've made. So for instance, we invited our local MP to see what we've done. Partly because we know he's active on social media, he'd started following us, and there's also the potential there for it to reach an audience we might not otherwise reach. Modifications. Toilets. We have toilets and they're open. They need a lot of cleaning, but they're open. Cafe. Our cafe is open for takeaway offer only, and there's access to outside seating if people want to go outside. The shop, we've put signs up to ask people not to pick things up unless they're really keen to buy them. And I've put advance tickets in. We're using Eventbrite, but it's really time consuming. And of course, it's adding costs on to every ticket we sell. We're looking at alternatives at the minute, but currently it's just Eventbrite we're using. So again, hints and tips, social media to gauge visitor expectation. So we've had lots of messages coming in from Facebook asking, are your toilets open? Is your cafe open? Is the walled garden open? All sorts of questions about the site. What would make you feel safe as a visitor? And what would encourage you to visit? I think that's a really useful question. Just think about your own museum. What would make it look and feel safe for people to come? And then a real practical one, stock up on cleaning materials. You'll need lots of them. So these are our hints and tips. We couldn't turn off our interactives even if we wanted to, because it would have turned off all the case lights in the main exhibition and it would have been incredibly dark in there without them. So we've supplied touchscreen pens for use with interactives. So what we're doing is we're giving each group of people who come a touchscreen pen for use on the day. They're not very expensive, so if they walk away with them, it's not the end of the world. But as they leave, there's a plastic rainbow coloured bowl that they can drop the pens into. And we're actually quarantining them until we reopen the following week. We're also spraying them with antibac spray as well. We did contact public health before we reopened. That might be something that's useful for some museums to think about. One of public health's tips for us was to make sure we opened windows. So we'd already highlighted that doors would be open where possible, but we also have opened windows. So all the windows in the public areas of the building that can open are open, regardless of the weather. We are finding people using the toilets, but it's less than usual. So I think there's a bit of cautiousness from around our customers there. Equally, we've also noticed customers aren't using handrails on the stairs like they would normally, but you still need to do regular cleaning. And speaking of cleaning, we worked out it takes at least, well, we're doing at least 400% more cleaning than we would usually, and that's throughout the day as well. It's taking a long time to do the cleaning. We're cleaning all the touch points, so the lift, the interior of the lift, and obviously everything you touch. The touch points in the building, so the stairs and any door handles that you need to touch to open. The exhibition space is anything that's flat surface that people might be touching. Toilets, flush toilet lids and seats, taps, even though our taps are automatic, we're still cleaning them. And in the access toilet and the nappy change area, they're traditional taps you need to turn, so they need extra attention. So there's lots of cleaning to take into account. So I'm trying to keep an eye on time, and I think time has just gone about half a minute. Think about how other sectors are operating in your local area, and reduce space for staff at counters. We can only fit one staff on our counter, one staff member on our counter. We usually have two if it's busy, and that also brings security issues because you need to keep an eye on what's happening. These are some things we think we could have done better with. So our ticket sales are lower than expected. We've found that our advanced ticket sales are dependent on weather forecast. Queues are taking longer to process because we've only got one staff member. Don't forget to take care of yourself and your team. We are moving towards a two-team approach, which means more weekend working, more front of house time for everyone. And we've had some increase in customer contact with people asking us stuff, but with staff still on furlough, that's creating us some issues for us. There's some signage we've done. Don't forget to include costs of signage and acrylic screens, etc. That's what our museum gallery looks like. We've done a one-way system which is available to you on our website. That's the view that greets you as you come in. You can see the shop units pushed back there. And we just got some social media messages, including the one from our MP. And some common sense points. I think Ben might be shouting at me because I'm running over my time. Sorry, Ben.
It's all good. Don't worry. It's really good.
So common sense, don't underestimate how long preparation will take. It takes a long time. I think we took a solid 3 days just preparing the inside of the building, marking floors out, cleaning, moving furniture, etc. Revenue may be lower than expected. Customer confidence is a really big issue, we think. Keep a close eye on the government guidelines, and don't forget to keep customer data in line with GDPR for 21 days for NHS test and trace, just in case the worst happens. Sorry, I live on a building site. There's a Caterpillar truck vehicle going past as I speak. Remember people, so visitors, staff, volunteers, everyone needs to feel safe. Try and keep the experience as close to normal as possible, and prepare for the unexpected. We've had problems with the burglar alarm, we've had problems with leaky roofs. All sorts of things have popped up because we've been closed for so long. If you want to contact me, that's my email address. Over to you, Ben.
Rob, fantastic, thank you. And hopefully for everybody on the course today, it's really useful to hear kind of what practical approaches you're taking to this. And there's been a few questions coming through as well. That one of my favourite topics is, so how often are the toilets cleaned? You talk about enhanced cleaning. The question was after every use. I'm assuming you're not doing after every use.
Not after every use, no. So we're doing very, very thorough clean first thing in the morning. So we're spending 2 hours cleaning the building every morning. And then after that, we're doing a lunchtime clean. And then depending on how busy they are, we can see them from reception, we're doing afternoon clean as well. But as I say, we've noticed people aren't using them as much as we thought. So we were originally intending cleaning them a lot more. It's handy, we can see the toilets from the reception desk, so we know how much they're being used. We've also noticed people are very good at following what we're asking them to do, so we're very clear about the 2 metre distance, we're very clear about hand sanitisers and washing your hands, and that seems to be happening. But the clean, when it happens, is thorough, so it's cubicles, walls, seats, taps, everything.
A question I had, because it's come up in some other forums, you're using online ticketing for the first time. How do you manage it if people turn up without tickets? Are they turned away, or do you have a process, or how's that potential conflict resolved?
We've not actually had people turning up who want a ticket. We've had phone calls, but not people turning up. We've got a very big sign that just says stop before you get through the gate. and it says if you don't have tickets, you can't come in. If we are finding we're getting phone calls in the morning, usually, of each day that we're open, if we have space, we're facilitating those before they come. So we will book them in and we can take payment for them when they arrive. What we're doing is we're producing a written register each day that shows who we're expecting in each time slot, and then we're ticking them off. So if people don't turn up, generally that's members because they're not paid for that particular space. So if people haven't turned up, we obviously know we're under capacity anyway. We've not reached the capacity we set yet, but interestingly on Sunday we felt we were pretty busy. So I think we're looking at perhaps reducing our maximum in line with that.
It's interesting that the point you make, particularly if the tickets aren't paid or you have members who don't have to pay for tickets. I think the Alva released some data, and there's another social media message about it yesterday. Some really high percentages of visitors not turning up who've pre-booked. I think it's like up to 40% on some sites, which is quite impactful. So
ours are much lower than that. We tend to get most of them coming, so we're talking single figures of people who aren't turning up each day.
Just a quick, we've just got a couple of minutes. One from Tessa is obviously talking about, I think it's more of an observation about the opening of the windows, and obviously that is the guidance. I know this is one of the areas actually that I think there's still a lot of discussion to be had, because there's an initial reaction to supporting COVID, but also if you're trying to maintain environmental conditions for the collection or historic fabric, there's a potential conflict there as well. I just wondered if for you, has that been an issue, or most of your objects in display cases?
Yes, that's where we're lucky. So our objects are nearly all in display cases, and we don't actually have any windows directly in the main exhibition space. So we have two exhibition spaces. We have an upstairs one which has much fewer objects in, all of which are cased. That does have windows and they are all open. Downstairs we've just got a breeze blowing through, but that's as much as we can do because it's like a secure box design. Yep. So the exhibition space has got rooms all around it with no direct windows in it.
So just mindful of time, one other question just came through about cleaning particularly. So have you been purchasing specialist cleaning products, or is it just an enhanced regime using the existing products you've already got?
We'd already been playing with different products before we closed, actually. So we found there's an antibacterial spray that works really well. So we've been using that. That's our main cleaning item at the minute. We use toilet duct type stuff in the toilets just because it smells nice. But everything else, our usual cleaning product, we just stocked up on this spray because it's really handy to walk around with. We originally thought we would use paper towels to do the cleaning because that's really hygienic, because once you use it, you throw it away. But to be honest, the practicalities of walking around with a black bin bag, paper towels, cleaning product just isn't workable. So we're using microfiber cloths and just washing them lots, and keeping them for specific tasks as well, obviously.
Great, thanks, Rob. So we're really tight on time, and you obviously put your contact details up there. So I'm hoping if anyone had any direct questions or anything from what you said, you wouldn't mind them getting in contact.
Yeah, happy to help.
Brilliant. Rob, thank you very much. That was really, really useful. It was great talking to you. And you're welcome to stay and listen to the rest if you want.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, for everyone, we'll just, I hope everyone found that really useful. I did. I think it's actually really useful to hear from someone who's living and breathing it, and just understanding that they're working with limitations as well, and that and hearing the solutions that have to come in, and also as well that a real positive for me. One of the final slides there was some of the feedback from visitors, and on social media and other forms. And yeah, I think visitors will be grateful to come back onto site if you communicate with them well. If you let them know why you're doing things, most of them will try their best to try and understand what you're doing. I think it's really useful. So we're just going to go back to the slides now. I shall move through. So we've had our case study, and there's actually a quick one here. Actually, I'm going to drop back out of the screen share. This is one from a museum in Auckland, and I'm just going to share with you a very short video, and then hopefully the technology will work. I am completely confident, and it just puts in place some of the actual practicalities of kind of walking around the site and what these may look like. So some of you may have seen this already. It's going to be about a 2.5–3 minute video. But I just thought it was a really good showing of how a site can reopen. So hopefully you can all see this. I shall press play, and the sound is enabled, so you should be able to hear it. So you might just want to.
All visitors coming into the museum have to register first using the Next Up system by sending a SMS or using the website. This helps the museum with both capacity management and contact tracing, and provides the visitor with the extra benefit of measuring queue wait time. I've already registered, and this is the confirmation page. I'm going to show this QR code to the staff as I go in. One of the things that's been quite impressive about Auckland Museum is that they've paid a lot of attention to privacy. So on their website and also here on the QR code scanning area, they've provided a lot of information. Usually in this area we would see large ticketing desks, but because Auckland Museum has stopped ticketing due to the lack of foreign visitors in the country, instead they've replaced those large visitor desks with these QR code scanning pods. One of the benefits of registering with the Next Up system is that it also tells you the queue wait time for the line outside the museum. The museum have got some great advice on their website, especially COVID-19. They also suggest bringing your own full water bottle. Fountains available, but they are being sanitised after every use. The museum I'm going to start my visit with a coffee. Auckland Museum's cafe is the best. Here in the queuing area there's lots of really clear signage, both on the ropes and on the floor. After each table is finished in the cafe, the staff are giving their area a very thorough clean, both tables and chairs. Auckland Museum for the first time is getting its visitors to go through the building in a very specific flow. So it means that areas like behind me are cordoned off so that visitors go through the right entrance to each area. The museum is using visual signals on the floor to indicate to visitors which way to go through the building. Because this area contains taonga or treasures, it is considered tapu or sacred, and usually visitors would wash their hands here before they leave to wash off that tapu. But this area has been closed, but the museum has done a really beautiful job. We can see some of the signage that was up from before the museum closed in foreign languages, where it was encouraging tourists to obey the Ministry of Health guidelines. In a city built on over 50 volcanoes, this is Auckland's favourite exhibit, but it is a high-touch area, and its eruption simulator crams people into a bedroom to imagine what an eruption looks like. So this area has been completely closed to the public. It's nice that the exhibit is still running though, so we can get a sense of what it would be like. There's heaps of cleaning happening all through the museum, very visible. Everyone who knows me knows I'm a major dino fan. Come and check it out. The museum has used their COVID-19 branded signage not just for safety messages, but also to show their new wayfinding. Sue, if you're watching, found your friend. The museum has closed most of its touch exhibits and interactives, including digital. This space is a really interesting area because the museum wants you to head that way through one side of the exhibit and come back the other way on the other side. So they're using the yellow dots on the floor to control visitor flow. The museum here on opening day is a little quiet, but there's quite a few visitors around. We've noticed two types of demographics. There are parents with young children, preschool age, and there's also a few couples wandering around too. Weird and wonderful.
So I stopped the video there. It's available online. I'll send you the link. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what it feels like to be in an organisation. Obviously, we're working virtually here, so I thought it would be really interesting for you just to see some of the measures being put in place. That was obviously from New Zealand, but a lot of the measures we're seeing implemented globally are fairly consistent. I think it's, again, what I'd encourage you to do is there's some great videos out there. A lot of organisations are actually using these as tools to communicate with their visitors. So the visitors can then go and see the video. And what I say as well, that you don't necessarily now, with technology available with phones, with videos, it doesn't have to be anything too polished. I think visitors are quite forgiving. They just want to get the information. So really think about how you could potentially. Equally, I've seen some really good social media feeds where they've just been using a series of tweets with images of parts of their site, just telling visitors, saying, this is what the visitor reception will look like. This is what your experience will look like. And this can give a lot of visitors a great deal of comfort in terms of organising their visit before they come back onto site. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation and the slides. So this is the link here. We can put it in the feed as well from Auckland Museum. And I'm just going to run through a few case studies just from around the UK. So these aren't going to be videos. It's going to be talking about just what how organisations are implementing responses and some of the patterns that we're starting to see here with these. So Chiltern Open Air Museum, so this is all public domain information. And what you'll see here is that again, their advanced online booking to limit contact and reduce visitor numbers, that they're not opening all of the buildings and all the sites. And I think there's a lot of organisations are quite concerned about, well, if they don't open up everything, does that impact the visitor experience? Again, I'd say as long as you communicate and then visitors have that knowledge before coming, allow your visitors to make that decision. And you need to think about the visitor experience when they come through. It was brought up in the chat function actually about card payments. So obviously a lot of sites are really keen to use them, but there are certain individuals and groups who don't like using contactless payment or using card payments and prefer using cash. You need to think about this and the measures that can be put in place. Obviously contactless or card payment itself does reduce the risk. Would you be accepting money in other ways? And you have to think about how that could be managed potentially. For example, in a food handling area or shop where that cash could potentially be a contamination point then for other things. So they'd be having to wash or clean their hands in between handling the cash and whatever else they were doing. So it is possible, but you would need to think about that. That they're currently coming out and saying they're not taking any school bookings. So I'm not seeing any examples of school bookings, particularly in this term with the school summer holidays about to start in many regions fairly shortly. But a number of institutions are getting inquiries about school bookings coming forward. So again, this is about getting clear policy. Also, if you have limited staff and resourcing, the more information you put on your website, the less time they will spend dealing with these inquiries as you go through. And that people need to know that the toilets are open. We'll come back to this one again. But for certain types of visitors, knowing what toilet facilities are available is critical to them being able to visit their site. They need to know that the facilities are there. So this is the kind of information that's being published out there. Again, an example from Central London, the Royal Academy that has reopened. It's a art gallery in Central London, fairly large. But it's even what I say, even the big institutions, I think about how they're reopening, they're reducing their visitor hours. They're only taking advanced booking, and they're saying, and even for Friends of the RA, so that's their membership group, that they're making even those groups who've been very used to just wandering in and having a certain kind of freedoms in terms of access, that they're having to be engaged with. And I know a number of sites are actually using the opportunity to bring either their friends or their members in for their initial opening, knowing that that group are going to be quite friendly and accommodating while you're trialing and testing some of these. So there's an opportunity there to bring in some of your tame visitors first before opening up to the wider public. They're actually using front of house to manage toilet queues. So maybe that's fine. Maybe that works for the Royal Academy. Maybe they have the resources. Maybe this is the only way they felt comfortable to open. So some people are physically managing toilet queues, but that level of resource won't be available to everybody. So you need to think about that. One thing I do want to highlight, particularly we're seeing here and the next case study with the National Gallery, is that they are requiring face coverings to be worn. So if you want to be anywhere inside the Royal Academy in London, you have to be wearing a face covering. So a lot of the majority of museums and galleries aren't requiring this. However, with the news I mentioned earlier about retail environments requiring to wear face coverings, I think the museum sector should be at least have in the back of their minds that either the expectation from the public maybe to wear them, or actually that further guidance comes in from central government about wearing face coverings. So I think it's something to think about. That they've got one-way routes around the galleries, contactless card payments, and they're still applying the 2 metre social distancing. So they've decided to stick to this even though they don't have to. And I know from speaking to contacts there that a lot of that is about making the visitors feel comfortable about visiting sites. So another one here, I think it's just, obviously these are two Central London ones, but I think they, as Rob mentioned, the bigger institutions have got the clout in terms of social media presence, in terms of management. So the messaging that's coming out and in the press around the National Gallery reopening and the Royal Academy of Art will filter down to your visitors and for the larger institutions within your region as well. So you need to be mindful of what they're doing, because this is setting an expectation about visits to the sites. So I quite like this one. Sorry, it's just a quote that came out of the reopening from the National Gallery's director. It said, "We want to be part of the nation's recovery story. And by opening the doors and letting the public back in to see our inspiring pictures, we want to make an important contribution to the process." And I think this is on a slight tangent from what we're talking about, but I think the arts and culture and heritage have a real part to play in getting us back to a semblance of normal, or a movement towards ways of working and ways of us living. And I know a number of arts organisations are opening, particularly those who are opening early, are not opening the doors knowing that it's that the business model is yet making sense, but feeling they have an obligation to reopen and to kind of start the process off. And also a little bit of, if not now, then when. So these are all forming in, and I'd encourage you to think about your own local considerations, though. You don't need to follow the herd. Make sure you're comfortable in terms of how you reopen. And so again, some of these from the National Gallery. Again, they're introducing PPE for staff, so we'll talk about PPE more. But I think they're just managing visitor expectations that they will be coming onto site and seeing staff wearing PPE. Enhanced cleaning, and also they're making that cleaning very visible, again to make visitors more comfortable. Alcohol gel stations placed throughout the visitors for visitor use. I know we can probably talk at length about this, but for anybody who's involved in collection care as well, I know there's a few discussions going on around alcohol gels and cleaning products, and particularly around historic fabric and collections where you can be in contact with as well. So it's something to be, I'm just pointing in the direction that you need to think about these, particularly if you've got historic fabric. One-way route, and again, you've got to book wherever you're going. Even the National Gallery is making sure you have to book before you attend. So I think it's really important to think about these. Again, an international case study, but one to kind of flag up. So this is the Royal Museum of Fine Arts over in Belgium. They opened up prior to the UK, so slightly earlier. So again, you're seeing a lot of similarities. One that's slightly different, and we're seeing more in Europe than the UK, is around temperature checks and monitoring. There are some examples of institutions reopening with health checks in place, but it seems to be in the minority in the UK. We're not seeing it being rolled out in high numbers, or not being advertised as being rolled out. And that'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on, whether that's, again, something that changes, and whether that part of the response that steps back up again is actually kind of health checking visitors. I know a number of people I've spoken to, they're trying to avoid that. They see it's quite a barrier to entry, and about making visitors feel comfortable coming within the space. And also how this aligns alongside other security precautions like bag checks and other things as well. And also we see here about they're offering face masks and gloves for visitors. They're providing them if you want them. This is an option for doing this. However, this may add a considerable expense, so something I'd think very carefully about doing. And one thing I'd go back to is the guidance from central government is saying, is that hand washing is as effective in terms of when you talk about gloves and face coverings. They're encouraging people to utilise their own ones. So think about how that can be applied in your local setting. And obviously make sure that light security checks are still in place. If any of you do bag checking, I know this is something that's, again, this is about potentially members of staff coming into contact with people's own personal possessions. So people are looking to adapt their bag check procedures if this is something that you would implement on your sites. Again, pointing in the direction, this is not only UK based, obviously museums around the world are looking to reopen. Here's some advice from the Alliance of American Museums, significantly abridged, but fundamentally going through the same processes that we're looking to put here, but it can be quite interesting. One of the benefits we have as the UK is that we have the opportunity to learn from other countries that have reopened considerably before us, although in America there are a number of institutions who still aren't open, and just look at their guidance and how they're looking to apply this. So in the US, the bottom one there, obviously enhancing clearing and ventilation as well. And if you have any mechanical ventilation, but there's a lot of discussion going on at the moment about bringing more fresh air into buildings, but that has potential the risk when it comes to maintaining collection conditions, so it should be thought about. Here's one, another one I just want to flag up. This is from Museums and Galleries Queensland. If nothing else, there's an awful lot of words on the screen. Sorry, I don't expect you to read all of those. But the first highlighted point is a really important one, that when you're calculating capacities and visitor flow around the building, don't forget that your staff and volunteers also need to be in those spaces. So I saw a few examples early on of some really great modelling, but they just hadn't thought about how their visitors, so how their volunteers and their staff would also interact in those spaces. So just make sure you don't forget those when you're modelling. And again, another one I really like, just ensure the signage is clear and easy to read using appropriate font size. And on Thursday, we'll talk more about this, particularly for those. A lot of you have put a lot of effort into making sure your signage is clear and readable by a number of people with various requirements, particularly around reading, and make sure that any of your temporary signage is also suitable for all of those. And we'll come on to some of the guidance around that. So that was a real kind of canter around what some of the case studies globally are looking like. And obviously the ones that we've looked at in the UK. But fundamentally, there's a pattern emerging in terms of how institutions are responding. So you can really look to see how these are being implemented. One thing we would say is around key visitor facilities such as toilets, there is probably a lack of clarity, and we're seeing quite a range of solutions put in place, from the incredibly intensively managed front of house, managing queues, one in, one out, deep cleaning on a regular basis, through to a much lower cleaning regime, and also and just allowing signage to manage how visitors use those spaces. So there's a kind of real range there. But again, obviously they've been risk assessed locally. And fundamentally, what you're seeing here is a range of solutions, and institutions are looking at the guidance and they are interpreting them differently. And you have the right to do that. I say you can look to others about how you want to do this, but look at that core guidance that we talked about earlier, particularly from central government. Make sure you're adhering with that. And then beyond that, you can then look to guidance from other organisations like NMDC and AIM and others, and just making sure that you're taking on board all of that, but making sure the decisions you make are locally risk assessed. So lessons learned and trends. We're moving to the last 20 minutes of this session, and what I want to do is just talk about, well, what does the broader picture look like, and how are we responding? So we've been doing a lot of work. We first of all started off while the UK was shut down, looking at how museums and galleries are reopening around the world. Some of you may have seen these trackers. Again, massively dense. If it's okay, we can issue these in PDF format for those of you to have a look at if you're interested. This is the global picture. So we started off, we actually did the overall tracker looking at when museums and galleries are reopening in various countries. One thing, when you look at the overall picture, you'll see that actually the UK is one of the latest to allow museums and galleries to reopen. So what I say to everybody, the silver lining to that cloud is we have an awful lot of case studies to learn from. But we're seeing broad trends around the world. Everybody's reducing visitor numbers, physical distancing is applying, there's ticket booking systems coming into place, that cafes are starting to reopen, but not necessarily everywhere, a lot of takeaway service. And so we're seeing the application of these solutions. So the reason I flagged this one up here is to go, look, we're all in the same boat, and there's an opportunity to learn from some of these. I'm going to come on to some of the UK more specific ones. Museums are reopening globally. However, not all have reopened. And again, they're risk assessing locally as well. They're applying their own schedules. And then we have time to learn from some of these others. So then, sorry, these are just some of the screenshots of it in more detail, so you can just see some of the measures that we're looking to capture. And as we look at in the dark green, fourth column along, we're talking about health checks on site, as I talked about. We're seeing a lot more health checks in institutions in other regions, particularly in the rest of Europe and in Asia, but some in the US and Australasia as well. This is becoming quite common and something that may have to come into play. Again, very labour intensive, and I think we have to think about that. But so far, the trend in the UK seems to be not to apply that. Also, that we're seeing that the interactives just aren't coming back into use. I've seen some interesting work being done recently with some interactives being developed to be controlled by foot operation, There's obviously less chance of contact, and kind of amending interactives. And also being very thoughtful around the signage, that where interactives are taken out of use. We all know the frustration of going into a gallery and having interactives out of use signs, and what impact that may have on the experience when you've developed and designed an experience that is quite interactive dependent. It's something that really should be thought about. So again, you see, I quite like a few quotes. I quite like this one from Peter Schneider in the New Yorker. He said, "Here's a prediction of our experience when we are again free to wander museums. Everything in them will be other than what we remember. The objects won't have altered, but we will have in some ratio or good or ill changed." So I think this is just, sorry, I was a slight misquote there, but fundamentally you get the principle here that we're going to be going back, visitors are going to be coming back into these spaces. The visitors' expectations will have changed, what they want from the spaces will have changed, and how we build spaces that can make them feel comfortable again and engage again and do all of those fantastic things that we've been looking to deliver over recent years. So in terms of globally, what we're seeing in those trends, we talked on some of these already, everybody's opening at their own pace. No two museum experiences are the same, and no two countries' regions will be applying things directly. There is no single case study I will point to globally or within the UK and say, this is what you should copy. Everybody has their own constraints, their own user constraints, their own staff visitor expectations. You need to think about those. So there are areas, again, globally that we don't seem to be seeing a clear resolution yet. I've mentioned toilets already, and PPE for staff is another one where we're not quite clear in terms of how that's being approached. We'll talk about the guidance on PPE in the next session. So we're just going to talk very briefly around how the UK cultural sector is reopening. Sorry, this is a slightly blurry screenshot, but we have been tracking and publishing on a weekly basis how UK institutions are reopening. We know this has been found really useful for a lot of people to see how their peers are responding and what the general consensus in the public is about what's acceptable. So we're listing these through. Again, we can send the PDF of this so you can go through it in detail when those reopening dates are. We're only publishing data that's available in the public domain, so we're only really tracking those that are going to be opening soon, although we know a lot are publishing dates that are moving into October and into August, September and October for reopening. So what are the general trends we're seeing, particularly around UK institutions? The grounds and outdoor exhibition spaces were the first to open, unsurprisingly because of the fresh air. Indoor areas are beginning to reopen now, but some sites are choosing to keep those closed. Toilets are generally open. We're seeing some limitation in terms of opening of those, where because of cleaning regimes, they're not opening every toilet on sites. I would consider you to think about the needs of all your visitors, particularly those who need access to either specific toilets or just general access to toilets to being able to conduct their visit, and they may not be able to come to site. For cafes, the broad trend seems to be for takeaway offers only. We're not seeing many examples of seated cafes, although they are beginning to open, particularly in the last week. Play areas are generally, as a rule, closed, or although government guidance for play areas outside of museum setting are that they can reopen, we may start to see some reopening. By the way, this tracker is something that we are using to really help build the conversation. So if you have information about your sites that you'd like included on the tracker, you can contact me if any updates, and then we're more than happy. We want to make this as comprehensive as possible to really help everybody across the sector. Shops, a number are reopening and thinking about how those can be done in a fairly managed way. It's quite important. So this is the cultural sector reopening. So this is just in short, this is just a screenshot so you can see the types of data as and when it's coming through. And this is another part that wasn't quite on the last screenshot. So we are also tracking the current measures that are in place. Sorry, you're only seeing part of this. So if you get the full tracker, you can see who these apply to. But I think it's really interesting to see the broader trends that we're seeing across the UK setting. And this is a bit of a snapshot of what those are. But fairly indicative that what we're seeing is that so a number of organisations, track and trace data is one we're going to talk to. It's mentioned actually by Rob, and the guidance is there that you do collect this data, and we will talk about that. However, not everyone's publishing that they're doing this. It seems to be something that there seems to be a reluctance. I'm not quite sure why. I'd be interested to get people's feedback about publishing that they will be collecting the data. Obviously, GDPR needs to apply. I need to think about these. Directed routes are coming into play. But they're not through, and we can and then health checks are coming in. So fundamentally, we're not seeing health checks. I think actually I've only seen one example, which was, I think it was the Cornish Seal Sanctuary, who said that they were going to be doing health checks, but we may see this changing. Enhanced cleaning, we're pretty much seeing on every site. By the way, when it says TBC, it's just the information is not available in the public domain. It doesn't mean these organisations aren't doing it. PPE and staff protection, there's kind of three potential solutions here. One is they're just not utilising it. The other one is that they're mandating all staff to use it. And what we're seeing more often is actually that organisations making it available to their staff and allowing them to make a judgment on whether they want to wear it or not. Obviously, if you risk assess certain scenarios, then there may be a requirement for staff to wear those if it's been fully risk assessed. But generally, there's a bit of a range of solutions in there. Pre-booked tickets is something that we're seeing in significantly high numbers. And actually, a lot of people reducing the use of audio guides interactives are coming off, but this is a changing picture. And it was quite interesting to hear from Rob. So their solution was actually to issue these smart pens, the kind of the touch points, so you can use those as you go around and still interact with your interactives if that so works. So, by the way, we'll send around a link to the tracker, because that was a fairly quick canter through that one. And also, we issue this on a weekly basis. So if you want to, you can message me directly and you can be added to the mailing list and you can get that issued out to you. But we'll get you a copy of the latest PDF version. It's also on our social media feeds as well. That one gets put out. So if you look on Twitter or LinkedIn for me or for Mortice Consulting, you can find it there and you get a link to it fairly quickly. So museums are reopening. We're seeing that even on individual sites, there is a phase reopening. So they may be opening up, but the cafes are only doing takeaway, that they haven't opened every toilet. So the internal spaces are limited in terms of how they reopen. And I think it's just really important for you, for your planning, to think about how you can learn from each of those as we go through. So again, another one of my quotes. Again, I quite like this one. And this is kind of, I think, as we're coming towards the end of this session this morning, just for us to think about how we approach the future going forward. There's great collaboration, so there have been some fantastic comments on the chat room. But I like this. I'd encourage you to engage with each other. Museums are not islands. Like any other work, the success of museums happens in a global context. In times of crisis, it is most important to support transnational collaboration, to learn from each other, to benchmark and to create a stronger voice for common concerns. Networks are an important platform for this. So this is one of them. I'd encourage you to engage in all of your networks and make sure that you work with all of your colleagues here. So what I would be encouraging you to do, we're in a virtual setting now. So if we were if we're in a formal meeting room, you would chat to each other a bit more. You can use the chat function for the bit of time you've got left. Equally, I'd encourage you when you come back for the next section, please do engage with each other. Feel free to ask each other questions as we go through. So summary and homework setting. So we're coming to the end of the session. This is a fairly light touch one. So I kind of appreciate that everybody's probably very busy at the moment. I'm assuming you're probably very busy doing a reopening planning. But ahead of our session on Thursday, all I'm asking is for you just to go away and potentially use some of the links, some of the guidance we put out, go and find your own, use the opportunity to share some information with your colleagues, and come back on Thursday having identified a source of information available in the public domain. That might be a piece of guidance, a website, a podcast, a video, an article, a quote, risk assessment. We saw some of those available online. Go and have a think about those, and then come back on for our next session, prepared to share that link, that source of information, just with a very short statement. And this may be something we might do in the chat room on our next session, and why you think it was really useful and important. And then we've got the opportunity to then share some of those, and you can think about where we are. So that's the homework. Hopefully that's clear. We're kind of at the end of the session now. We've got a few minutes left. We've done very well on timing, which is great. But I'm here, and I just wonder, you can either use the chat, or I'm happy for you to come off mute. And if there's any particular questions or topics we haven't covered off, anything you're really keen for us to see covered off in the next session. Obviously, for the next one, just so you're aware, we're going to go into very specific detail around visitor social distancing, on staff welfare and volunteer welfare and protection, so kind of PPE. We're going to be looking at particular solutions for toilets and lifts. So in the next session, we're going to get down into the real practicalities of what do we do, what does the signage need to look like, what cleaning regimes is another one of our focus points. what we do about cafes and shops. Outdoor areas, are they completely free of risk, or are there still considerations we need to make? And then having a bit of time thinking about communication strategies for visitors and staff. So it was really interesting to hear from Rob. He said, although they've got very limited ability to engage, they said they've got a website, they've got a Facebook page, they are still actively using those. And it appears that their visitors are using these feeds to engage with the information and plan their visits. So think about what you can do in terms of your limited resources available to you to communicate with your visitors, potentially put surveys out to them to gauge their expectations before they even come to site and help you in your planning. So can your visitors be part of that planning and at the same time give them the opportunity to learn a bit about what you're planning to do on site? So there's kind of real kind of collaborative effect that can come in there. And we'll be going through some of those. And also, as with today, if there are specific topics you want to cover off, we're happy to kind of spend some time on those as well. So there's no questions coming through on the chat, which I'm assures me that I've been fully comprehensive and answered all of your questions that I possibly could have answered already. I will say, with a very small apology, we have gone through at great speed a massive area in terms of guidance, in terms of what's going on. Hopefully, though, this is giving you a few takeaways, some ideas that are going to help you with your reopening planning. It's signposted you towards some other really good sources of information that are out there and are available, and organisations who are working really hard to help support you at this time. And like I did mention earlier, but I would say that if for any of those organisations who are doing this, why not give them a bit of feedback? Why not engage with them? Don't just digest this. Because for them as well, I know that getting feedback about what works or what doesn't work, or what questions you may have, really is going to help them develop, because this support around responding to COVID and reopening is something that's going to need to be in place for the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, potentially. This is the new reality we're in, and it's not a fixed picture. It's going to be changing. We need to think about how that will change and how we're going to respond to the next changes. And God forbid, further lockdowns, further restrictions, what impact does that have? Or just new advice and new guidance, whether it be face coverings or PPE, and we need to think about that going forward. So you've probably heard enough of my voice. I'll take a breath and just see if, sorry, there was a question on there about a link to the tracker. I haven't actually got the link at the moment. So either we'll get it sent round, or at the beginning of the next session, I will send you a link so you can get access to the PDF tracker. But if you go on to Twitter or LinkedIn and look for Mortice Consulting, or for me, you'll find quite quickly in my feed, it will be available there on that as well.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Like Ben said, it was a real whiz through, and I'm looking forward to Thursday when we get down into the nitty gritty of various things. And as Ben said, I think it's just so important for us all to draw on our contacts across our museum networks. So any forum groups or museum groups that you're part of, do get in contact with people and find out how they're doing things, because that peer-to-peer support is just so important at this time. So thanks very much for attending the session, and I'll look forward to seeing you all on Thursday. We'll send out the joining instructions tomorrow for Thursday's session. The password will be sent Thursday morning. It's just security, keep everything locked down on Zoom. We'll also send all the links that were in the chat, so don't worry about having to stay on and scribble those down. I'll make sure those all get circulated, and I'll just send out a reminder about the homework as well when I send out the joining instructions for Thursday, and hopefully you'll all have a bit of time to do that. Just to say a couple of things, we've got some more post-lockdown webinars coming up. There's one which is we're doing with kids in museums, which is focusing on family-friendly reopening on the 20th of July, and another one which is reopening with inclusive practice, which is happening on the 30th of July with the Disability Collaborative Network. And I think that's going to be a really interesting one. You know, if we have to start introducing face masks, how do you balance that with the access needs that people might have? So that'll be an interesting session. And you can book those on our Eventbrite page, which is linked through our blog. So you feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye, and see you on Thursday. And thanks very much to Ben and Rob for the really fantastic case study. Thank you very much.